Three men, $200,000 in gold, and the greatest Western of all time. Each entry in Sergio Leone's Dollars Trilogy is a classic of the Western genre. A Fistful of Dollars created the spaghetti Western by co-opting Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo. For a few dollars more, elevated the director's vision with a more personal and complex story. And The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly turned that revisionist approach into a sprawling myth. Quickly building off the success of the first two films before they were even released internationally, director Sergio Leone reteamed with star Clint Eastwood for what would be their final collaboration, the capstone to what came to be known as the Dollars Trilogy, and a monumental achievement in the history of the Western. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was released in Italy on December 23, 1966, and then in the United States the following year, quickly making waves for its blend of stark violence and operatic storytelling. And in the years since, this saga of three men in search of their fortune in the midst of the Civil War has become one of the most important films in the history of the Western, creating a modern revisionist approach to the Wild West that every Western in the nearly 60 years since is influenced by to some degree. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly isn't just one of the greatest films of all time, it's my own personal favorite movie. But let's not get my own preferences in the way. This is an examination of how Leone's epic Western of revenge, greed, friendship, and death managed to not only tear down the old Hollywood myths of the morally upright Western, but replace it in the process. How its blend of epic scale and characters placed under a microscope elevated a simple story into one that captures the violence, greed, and redemption of its time and place. And how an Italian production managed to redefine an American institution. Come with me as we explore Sergio Leone's definitive Western epic, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. With For a Few Dollars More a success in Italy, movie studio United Artists approached its screenwriter Luciano Vincenzoni to buy the international rights for the film, and whatever Part 3 might be. And while Leone and producer Alberto Grimaldi gave Vincenzoni the go-ahead, the writer didn't actually have any ideas on what the next film might be about. Years later, Vincenzoni would claim that he came up with his pitch for the film that would be The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly on the fly, while meeting with United Artists, and securing a distribution deal with the company that gave the upcoming film a $1.2 million budget, a sizable expansion from For a Few Dollars More's $600,000. The script that resulted has been debated by every party involved, with Vincenzoni claiming he wrote it before leaving the production after fighting with Leone, and Leone claiming that Vincenzoni had him hire comedy writers Agonore Incrucci and Furio Scrapelli, with the script they made deemed unusable, forcing the director to fix it. As a result, all four men are credited for the finalized screenplay. Of course, the entirety of the film hinged on whether Clint Eastwood would return to the role of the man with no name. Easier said than done. Given that Eastwood's career was essentially made by these movies, it may seem strange that he never worked with Leone again post-Dollars Trilogy, until you find out that Eastwood was basically miserable while making them, and had to be lured back to make this trilogy capper with a $250,000 payday, 10% of US profits, and a Ferrari 275 GTB. That car is worth more than $2 million today, and is still part of Eastwood's collection. Still, Leone's impact on Eastwood's career and filmmaking vision was undeniable, with Eastwood eventually dedicating the disillusioned 1992 Western Unforgiven to Sergio and Don Siegel, who also helped him break through. Still, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was a Leone production, not an Eastwood one, and its story, filmmaking, and themes are emblematic of the Italian creator's filmography both before and after. Despite running 2 hours and 40 minutes long, even longer in recent versions with deleted scenes added back in, which I don't think is necessary and hurts the pacing of the film, the plot really only has two major elements. First is the search for $200,000 worth of stolen Confederate gold hidden somewhere by the runaway soldier Bill Carson, with the ruthless bounty hunter known only as Angel Eyes, played by Lee Van Cleef, on its trail. The second is the partnership-turned-rivalry of Tuco Benedicto Pacifico Juan Maria Ramirez, played by Eli Wallach, a criminal with a list of crimes longer than this movie, and the bounty hunter called Blondie, played by Clint Eastwood, who turn on each other when their scam comes to an end, with Tuco wanting to kill Blondie for his betrayal. Eventually, their personal war intersects with the dying Bill Carson, putting them on a collision course with Angel Eyes, as each man goes after the gold. With that quest for gold taking each man across the Southwest, crisscrossing deserts, frontier towns, prison camps, churches, and more, Leone and Vincenzoni paint an epic portrayal of greed and revenge, giving way to mutual understanding against the brutal waning days of the American Civil War.
Put your drawers on and take your gun off.
And much like how Leone's revisionist take on the Western in his previous two pictures created a more violent, unforgiving picture of the Wild West, his portrayal of the Civil War is similarly unglamorous, filled with the wounded, the broken, and the lost, in a story that removes the reasons for war and leaves us only with its toll. Like the previous films and most others that would follow in its style of the so-called spaghetti western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was filmed by an Italian crew in Spain, using the country's deserts and more arid climate to approximate the Wild West, with the film largely shot around Castilla y León. But one distinguishing feature of Leone's choice of location is that, by removing the famous, naturally colorful backdrops of US landscapes like Monument Valley or the Grand Tetons, which have become synonymous with the classic westerns of John Ford and Howard Hawks, these dry, shrub-filled wastelands of dirt and desolation naturally remove the romanticization that the morally upright westerns of the past connected to their larger-than-life heroes. Men both good and bad die face down in the dirt here, with neither nature nor humans idolizing their brutal final moments. Leone's westerns quickly gained fame and notoriety for the blunt, shocking for the time, approach to violence. GBU accentuates this even further, very quickly centering the brutality of this vision of the West thanks to the arrival of Angel Eyes, who not only shoots an unarmed man with a hidden gun under the table, but guns down the man's young son without hesitation. Both Angel Eyes and the film itself take so little time to acknowledge this that it's easy to not think about the suddenly devastated family left in its wake. But once Angel Eyes executes his employer under a smothering pillow, you really can't avoid it anymore. The war itself is conveyed almost entirely through acts of violence. An execution pit stop, non-stop cannon fire, a young soldier left alone to slowly die, a body strapped to the front of a train, a prison camp where crying soldiers play beautiful music to disguise torture, and a pointless, unending battle where bodies are thrown at one another every day. Like I've discussed in my previous videos on the Dollars Trilogy, Leone's films may have made an impact at the time because of their very stark depictions of violence, when the Western was still mostly clean-cut and staunchly heroic. But Leone's shootouts aren't memorable because of their violence. They aren't filled with dozens of bullets flying and action that goes on and on. They're all about tension and anticipation. Everyone locked in a duel or shootout with one another fully knows that death is moments away, and so we hold our breath with them. Then, the release of tension and the end of life. Like everything else here, the shootouts of GBU heighten the approach taken in the previous two films. Duelists wait to draw even longer. The camera pushes in even tighter on faces. The stakes of these gunfights are even higher, and the results are more brutal. A Fistful of Dollars made waves by framing its duelists in the same shot at the moment of impact, showing the effects of a bullet for a less glamorous but much more stylish depiction. And in an early shootout here, Leone feels like he's almost daring his audience to see if he can take it any further. It's no longer man versus man, but a gun and its targets. It's a film of hard contrasts, with Leone and cinematographer Tonino Dellicoli alongside editing by Nino Baragli and Eugenio Alabiso, crafting wide shots that sometimes last for 20 to 30 seconds, steadily observing the landscape and the people that move across it like ants, existing side by side with extreme close-ups of rough, craggy faces. The most extreme close-ups of Leone's career so far, where frantic eyes and jittery fingers loom larger in the frame than mountains. Shot mostly on an Arriflex 35 IIC camera with a 2.35:1 ratio on 35mm film stock, this is ultra-wide lens cinematography that captures the grandeur of its setting, while Leone's own attitude undermines the beauty of it with harsh, cruel men who were forced to side with, like, and root for in an uncaring world. The way Leone introduces his three main characters says everything you really need to know about them in an instant. In his signature style that he'd recreated in a much slower fashion in Once Upon a Time in the West, the film opens with three unspeaking men closing in on a bar, only for the shootout inside to happen off-screen as Tuco crashes through the window, freeze-framed in a blur as the Ugly. Tuco is messy, a coward, devious, and his motivations are unclear. Angel Eyes comes straight toward us out of the desert, a vision of living death that kills everyone in his way, labeled the bad while laughing in the dark. Pure evil. And finally, Blondie strides into frame with his face obscured, blasting away the competition to save Tuco only to turn him in for the money. Of course, it's more complicated than that, as the reveal that these two have done this several times, ending with Blondie dumping him in the desert, highlighting the gray morality of our seeming hero, with the freeze frame label of the good coming just as the film accentuates just how dubious that label really is. Years later, when Leone was asked what he saw in Eastwood, who at the time was only acting in the TV show Rawhide and had no prospects in film, the director described him as a block of marble, and that he compared him to the stone that Michelangelo chose to shape into the statue of David. He simply saw Eastwood as untapped potential that fulfilled his vision. And after 3 films, Leone and Eastwood aren't looking to turn their man with no name into a suddenly complex, growing character, but instead to surround him with a more morally complex and tragic world. Here, Blondie has no real goal beyond making money, usually off bounties, and doesn't mind breaking laws and morals to do so. He's actually far less heroic than Fistful, where he ultimately saves the town from 2 warring gangs, or for a few dollars more, where he sides with Colonel Mortimer's quest for revenge, instead of simply collecting bounties. While we do see some of Blondie's sympathies as he better understands Tuco and the countless men killed in the Civil War, it rarely goes beyond a knowing look or a bit of comfort. In describing his star's acting, Leone said, "Clint Eastwood throws himself into a suit of armor and lowers the visor with a rusty clang. It's exactly that lowered visor which composes his character, and that creaky clang it makes as it snaps down, dry as a martini in Harry's bar in Venice, is also his character. Look at him carefully. Eastwood moves like a sleepwalker between explosions and hails of bullets, and he is always the same, a block of marble." Still, that's the power of this character. Whether you see these 3 films as all starring the same person, or that these are 3 different cowboys, the man with no name is an archetype of strength and resiliency in the Wild West, that's able to withstand the worst of both nature and man in a relentless pursuit. It's everyone else around Blondie that is either saved or broken by this revisionist spirit of the brutal West. Of course, in contrast to Lee Van Cleef's Angel Eyes, Blondie feels much more heroic, with the true villain of the piece really only taking up a small portion of the film, disappearing for almost an entire act before showing up taking advantage of the prison camp, then disappearing again until the climax. It's the combination of absolutely no character development and his regular commitment of heinous acts when actually around that turns Angel Eyes into an unforgettable villain despite his limited presence. And Van Cleef really makes the most of it, creating a character that's a complete 180 from his heroic Colonel Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More, who was essentially the central figure of that middle film. Van Cleef and Leone really lean into his villainous side, bathing his hawk-like features in shadow, a permanent scowl on his face, and a willingness to create new alliances and break them whenever he sees fit. Of course, that goes for all 3 of these men, who each take turns befriending and betraying one another in their search for the gold. It's just that Angel Eyes is much more violent in his backstabbing. Given a slight change of perspective, any of these 3 men could be given the title anti-hero, hero, or villain. And it's that murky morality that makes Leone's film into a stark break from Western tradition. One of the great achievements of Leone's film is that it not only slowly becomes Tuco's story above all, but the film deliberately goes out of its way to illustrate how despicable he is at the beginning, only to make us understand him, like him, and root for him by the end. The early running joke of Tuco's many heinous crimes being listed out gives way to more and more reveals about his life and the way he owns up to his faults. Specifically, it's Tuco's encounter with his brother, now a priest tending to wounded soldiers from any side in the war, that highlights how the man we see is the product of desperation, self-loathing, and greed.
Where we came from, if one did not want to die of poverty, one became a priest or a bandit. You chose your way, I chose mine. Mine was harder.
Alienating him from his family to the point of not even knowing that his parents have died in the years since he cut all ties. And it's really thanks to Eli Wallach, in reality Polish and Jewish, but playing several Mexicans in westerns around this time, pretty common for the first 80 or so years of the Western really, who gives a layered, often comedic performance, taking turns being the butt of the joke and the heart of the film. We all understand that Blondie is essentially untouchable, and that Angel Eyes has to die by the end, but the uncertainty of Tuco's fate really adds drama to the film. Surrounding these characters is a vibrant cast of actors both old and new to the Dollars Trilogy, with Leone once again bringing back familiar faces in similar roles for this revisitation to greed, vengeance, and death in the West. The humongous Mario Brega is once again the second in command for the third of 3 films. Aldo Sombrel, Benito Stefanelli, and Lorenzo Robledo are once again part of the villain's gang like the rest of the trilogy. Luigi Pistelli returns in a very different role as the brother priest Pablo Ramirez, and several more faces fill out the cast, helping this trilogy to solidify its archetypes and break them in noticeable ways through differences in role. And like any Leone movie, you can't discuss it without giving proper due to composer Ennio Morricone. But The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is one of his most important and well-known works. One of the reasons why Morricone's music and Leone's films blend together so organically is because the creation of the music often came well before filming, with Leone saying he's never read a script of mine to compose the music, because many times he's composed the music before the script is ever written. What I do is give him suggestions and describe to him my characters, and then, quite often, he'll possibly write 5 themes for one character, and 5 themes for another, and then I'll take one piece of one of them and put it with a piece of another one for that character, or take another theme from another character and move it into this character. And when I have my characters finally dressed, then he composes, and records with a small orchestra, 12 pieces, and then we listen to it, and then we go on to the script. Unfortunately, the main theme, like the title of the film itself, has become so overused in pop culture references that it's almost lost its power. But ignore all the frankly lazy shorthand that it's been used for and instead see it within the context of the film, and you remember just how brilliant it is. With the theme introduced in the opening credits, we experience how Morricone slowly adds layer after layer of instruments, transitioning from a quiet melody to a galloping march by the end. Electric guitar, trumpets, mouth harp, choir, whistling, drums, recorder, bass ocarina, and chimes are all put to use here, with Morricone adding a repeating leitmotif that symbolizes each of the 3 men. Tuco is a yodeler. Angel Eyes is an ocarina, and Blondie is a recorder, each repeating the same notes to varying effects to showcase how while these 3 men are different in nature, they are all kindred spirits that, together, create an epic musical tapestry. I've always felt that music is more expressive than dialogue, said Leone. I've always said that my best dialogue and screenwriter is Ennio Morricone, because many times, it is more important a note or an orchestration than a line said. When you manage to express something with a look and the music instead of saying it with words or have the characters speak, I think it's a more complete work. But Morricone produces several other incredible pieces throughout the film beyond its theme. The Ecstasy of Gold is a swirling, delirious piece of obsession that feels so organically tied to its scene and the way Leone shoots Tuco's search that it gives me chills every time I experience it. With guitars, trumpet, and a haunting female vocal performance, building to a crescendo that lasts way longer than you'd expect, keeping audiences and character enraptured until its sudden stop. And then there's the trio for the film's climax, with Morricone making the unconventional choice to place the sounds of distant gunfire into the track, played during the standoff and letting us into each man's violent mind. Like many of Morricone's dual songs, he chooses to create a sense of building repetition as jangly guitars hesitate and then explode, with a wailing trumpet that makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, only to recede and then give way to trumpets again, with this cycle of anticipation happening several times, as our combatants are slowly choreographed into position, and the rapid-fire editing really takes us to the edge of our seat. Like every Italian picture of the time, GBU was filmed without recorded sound and with each actor speaking his or her native language to be dubbed over later in ADR. Leone often played Morricone's finished music while shooting to emphasize his intended tone. The result, while off-putting at first, is a heightened reality where dialogue and actor are often at a slight mismatch.
Tell Baker that I told him all that I know already. Tell him I want to live in peace, understand? That it's no use to go on tormenting me.
And the effects used make every single gunshot sound so massive, they could blow a building down. Leone seems to be very aware of this and parodies it during the film, creating a match cut between Tuco's gun barrel and a firing cannon that takes us a second to fully recognize. With gunfights this massive, what's the difference really? It's in the framing and editing that Leone really heightens his world, and less in the way that the world is created. The entire world of the film expands or shrinks simply depending on what the frame chooses to show us, blowing up to a massive impassable desert, or shrinking down to the eyes and hands of duelists. Nothing outside of these frames exists to its obsessive central figures, which is why both Blondie and Angel Eyes can no-clip into the grave-digging scene without making a peep.
Two can dig a lot quicker than one.
The thing is, for all its flair and larger-than-life characters, Leone was also dedicated to authentic recreations of the clothing, weapons, and locations of the Civil War time period. The duster, now a staple in Western costume design, was really first used here as Leone's historical research highlighted it as a common clothing item in the dusty, harsh West. The guns, while more powerful in their effects than the weapons of the time, are all from the era. That authenticity adds rawness to the world. No bright white hats and pressed shirts here. That shit would be disgusting by the end of the day. And then there's the real danger of so much of the filmmaking. When the time came for the battle-centric bridge to be blown up by Blondie and Tuco, the production really did dynamite a real existing bridge, not a staged one. And when that bridge was blown up prematurely by the Spanish army before cameras rolled, the army built it again free of charge to create the earth-shaking explosion seen on film. Score, cinematography, direction, acting, and editing are all working in perfect concert with one another here, capturing the power of film as the product of many different elements and many different talents, all working toward the same goal. Like the rest of Leone's films, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly can easily be taken as straightforward entertainment. But there's a massive streak of anti-war criticism that runs throughout the film, informing its plot, character decisions, and both its tragedy and comedy. Having GBU set during the Civil War was decided on right from the first impromptu pitch, and turns this into a prequel to the other two movies. But the finished film makes its time and place into much more than setting. Blondie, Tuco, and Angel Eyes remain largely indifferent to the war raging on around them, often seeing it as an inconvenience to their pursuit, or even using it to serve their own needs. And yet, Leone's film also depicts the war as indifferent to the hundreds of thousands of men whose lives it takes, with the effects of the Civil War winding in and out of the film. Rather than emphasizing the reasons for the conflict, Leone focuses on the toll. The endless stream of both Confederate and Union soldiers plays as a roaring background to the story, with executions, attacks, and the painfully dying. Blondie and Tuco are taken to the fictional Batterville camp, based on the real-life Andersonville, where massive corruption and torture run rampant. A late film encounter with an endless battle over a bridge highlights the war's infinite stream of fodder thrown at the other side, as a captain laments only wanting to destroy the bridge to save lives, but being unable to do anything.
I've done it. I've blown it up. Boom! In here. I destroyed it all.
And Blondie's quiet comfort of a single young dying soldier highlights the real human toll of the war that our central characters have chosen to ignore during the rest of the movie. Somehow, Leone and Vincent managed to use the Civil War to make our treasure hunt feel selfish, while also using that hunt to make the war seem like a waste. Of course, this being the Civil War adds more context here, but rather than focused on the very real toll of slavery, I see it as a commentary on war as a whole. Leone, after all, was born in 1929 and was a young boy who saw the rise of fascism in his home country and the destruction of World War II in Italy while growing up, becoming obsessed with death in all forms in the films he chose to make. Collectively, the experience of Leone's movie builds and builds upon itself. Thanks to its luxurious pace, GBU is fine with taking its focus away from the buried gold for a large portion of its runtime. For the first half of the movie, it's only Angel Eyes who knows about it, while Blondie and Tuco fight their personal war against one another, only happening upon Bill Carson and his runaway coach in the desert at the edge of death, suddenly realigning their purpose to finding the gold and putting aside their differences. The focus of the entire movie is very simple. 3 men fight over money, but Leone and Morricone frame this to be a mythic conflict of titans of the West. Best of all, I think that GBU is a film that actually gets better and better across its runtime. None of it is weak, but the first half feels a little unfocused, until the cumulative effect of better understanding these characters and their motivations strengthens the movie as it goes along. But absolutely nothing beats the film's final 30 minutes, as our characters close in on the gold. Everything from the bridge explosion on, including the ecstasy of gold scene, the uncovering of Arch Stanton, the Mexican standoff finale, and Blondie's farewell are complete perfection, and all almost done without any dialogue. We really don't need much talking by this point because we know everything we need to know about our characters, their motivations, and their relationships to one another. Instead, Leone is much more interested in creating compelling images, building up tension, and turning this into an unforgettable experience, while Morricone conveys the feelings of the characters, shifting from mourning to mania to murderous intent. To me, there's no greater duel in the history of the Western than our final three-way standoff, because we've become so invested, know this can only end in tragedy, and ultimately have our beliefs subverted for something so much more satisfying. Now, as we all know, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the 7th greatest movie of all time, ranking just below Evil Dead 2, Predator, Kiki's Delivery Service, Chungking Express, Before Sunset, and Shin Gojira, and above Rear Window and Tron Legacy. But it's been my personal favorite film ever since I was a teenager, just so happening to catch it airing on TV one Saturday afternoon, tuning in at least half an hour late, with its cinematography pan and scan cropped, and plenty of commercials jammed in. And even then, I was hooked. Its twisting story, incredible shootouts, quiet moral complexity, and epic sweep rocked my world. All these years later, there's still nothing better to me. So much of Leone's work draws its impact from dispelling the myth of the Western. No more white hats and black hats. No more taming of the frontier for the greater good. In their place were deeply flawed men who strode across the Wild West to make a fortune for themselves. And yet, in the process, Leone and his fellow creators made a new myth. One for the modern era of disillusionment in the goodness of humanity, and a time where we stopped believing in our own myths. In its place were 3 men, $200,000 in gold, and the greatest Western of all time. Thanks for watching today's video, and after so many years, I've finally covered something that I thought I might never would. That's right, I finally made a video on my favorite movie of all time. And like I said in the video, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly has been my favorite movie for quite a few years. Even as I continue to expand my film taste and understanding, nothing has ever quite matched up to me. And by this point, it's probably always going to be my favorite movie. So obviously, it's a bit intimidating to want to make a video about the movie that you love most of all. But as we get to the end of this year, you'll see that I've decided to make a lot of big videos about topics that I've always wanted to cover. It's sort of a bucket list, if you will. Not that I'm going anywhere, but why not make the videos that I really want to make, right? Anyway, I think that The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the greatest Western of all time. Really even just outside of my own personal preferences of it being my favorite movie. To me, this is perfection in the genre, and everything the Western could possibly be. Obviously, before this, I did videos on A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, and I absolutely loved making those videos. And now the trilogy is finally complete. But I don't think that I'm done making videos about the works of Sergio Leone, or Westerns overall, really. I'd love to make a video about Once Upon a Time in the West someday, and make a lot more Western videos. Maybe one about gateway Westerns to help people get into the genre. If that's interesting to you, let me know what you'd like for me to cover as far as Westerns go. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video, and exclusive Patreon-only podcast reviews. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and enjoying a great Western.